Life's Learning Curve, episode 49. Just around the corner from Around the Corner Candy Store, right here in the Midwest, you've got Life's Learning Curve, the podcast. I'm former educator turned media producer Paul Hart, and I'm your host. Our podcast is about finding the best us, getting better, and we do that through reflection, and we do that through some storytelling along the way. In the past, I have told you a few stories about my really fortunate, incredible, dynamic relationship with my maternal grandfather and the impact he had on me. We were these two uncommon pals, and from the moment I was born until his passing when I was in 7th grade, my grandpa treated me like his cohort, his companion for a lifetime, a man's man. But all the time, at his side was my maternal grandma, Ruth. We called her Dee Dee, but for this episode, I'll just call her Gramma Ruth. You know, it's funny how so many of us think that our grandparents' life began when we were born. Yep. But that is so incredibly untrue. And that's a reason why this podcast even exists, because I was at a couple recent family funerals where I watched the adult children get up at the church ceremony and speak of their deceased parent. Immediately I noticed something was missing. It was really obvious that the part that had come before that child was born in the person's life who was deceased. It was missing. Those details, their younger years. So on today's episode, I want to share with you a reality, a strong, dynamic reality, how one person, one selfless person can exist quietly while making a lot of noise. So let's get going. Sebastian. Life's Learning Curve. I'm Paul Hart. Episode, The Perfect Bite. Stand by. She outlived my grandpa by almost 30 years. Before I was born, my Grandma Ruth was a church leader and participated in women's groups. 40s and 1950s. A farm wife, then a city wife, and she raised 3 of her own kids. She took great care of her husband, my grandpa. She was dedicated, as she was a wife, a mom, a gardener. She loved the garden. A Christ follower, a pianist. She loved music. Played organ as well, a lover of laughter, laughed a lot, a friend, a grandparent. She was so good at all these things that she took 100% of her life, 100% of her time, so she could nurture all of us, selflessly. At only around 5 feet tall, she endured 2 world wars, 3 major heart attacks of her own, and outlived 2 of her own children, one being my mom. So on this episode, I will try and synthesize some parts of my Grandma Ruth's life. You know, you're only as good as the person you're standing beside. And that was my grandma, standing beside my grandfather. He was good for her, she was good for him. Grandma Ruth was the foundation of courtesy and used this firm but calm gentleness to support and nurture friends and family for multiple generations. But as I said before, my Grandma Ruth lived most of her life, well, you know, obviously before I was born. Way before I was born. She was born in the year 1900. Turn of the century. Going back a few years with my sister Sue, when she was at age 16, she sat down with my Grandma Ruth and she wrote down an account of a story my Grandma Ruth, who was then 69, shared with my sister Sue when Sue turned 16, as I said. Why did she tell my sister a story when my sister was 16? It's because my grandmother married my grandfather when she was age 16. She shared just how she met my grandfather.
It was the harvest ball, the most beautiful time of the year, when the moon shone big and full, and the fields harvested after a long dry summer. And the sparkling bursts of color painted the trees in long swaths of orange, yellow, and red. My dress was a pale rose chiffon. My mother and I had shopped and shopped for the fabric to find exactly the right shade of rose to complement my complexion. Mother put the finishing touches on my dress just this afternoon, and here I am, full of expectation and anticipation at the ball. My brothers, older than I, are horsing around in the corner with some of their other friends from school. They seem to have no idea how very handsome they are. But I would never in a million years admit that to them. They seem oblivious to the girls who giggle as they walk past. The pavilion is quite crowded with young people. Girls are milling about in their most beautiful gowns with their best friends, checking out the boys in all their finery. I know some of them from school.
Hello, Ruth.
They stop to say hello, and we talk for a few moments about the beautiful evening in each other's dresses. Somehow, when we are dressed up, we act a bit more grown-up.
Beautiful night. I like your
I saw
dress.
some of these girls earlier today at the local store in their everyday dresses, and they were as casual and relaxed as could be. Tonight, there is an excitement, a nervous energy in the room. My brown shiny hair is long and wavy, but pulled up tonight in a fancy chignon that my mother created for me. I feel beautiful, but a bit unsure of myself. I am standing alone with my punch cup in hand, having already gone through its contents. There is laughter everywhere, and I am smiling because of it. My entire life is ahead of me, as only 16 years have passed, and I'm going to make the most of it. As I look across the room, there is a boy who I can't quite take my eyes off of. He is taller than most, athletic, dark brown hair and eyes. I think he looks a bit exotic. I steal a look now and then without really meaning to. I catch his eye. When I do so, I'm caught off guard and blink. Just once. One blink. He's coming over to me. He's making his way through the crowd and coming my way. Really? He can't be coming to me. He must have another purpose to be walking towards my way. I look down, somewhat shy. He speaks. Hello, my name is Harold. I see you are out of punch. In your cup, I mean. May I get you some? I could hardly breathe. I smile up at him. Oh my. He is so incredibly handsome. I finally am able to say, that would be very kind of you. He takes my cup and offers his arm. We walk to the punch bowl together. I can hear the other girls whispering as we walk past them. I never look back.
Now, most of my connections with my Grandma Ruth and my Grandpa Harold were very close with our family. My mom's parents came to our house often once or twice a week, and my sister and I frequently spent the night at their house just down the Fox River on maybe every other weekend. I was really close to them those early years. My grandpa and I bonded right away. He kind of liked having me around, and I didn't know. I just knew that I liked being with him, and he seemed to like being with me, and we just did a lot of things together. I learned to count at my grandparents' house as I counted cans of tomato soup in his pantry. Always 20 cans. If you come from the Great Depression, you always have a stockpile of things. I learned to have what he called a short glass of Pepsi after a day's work in the yard, probably with my grandparents, both of them. I learned to draw mechanically, and that was my grandpa. He had been a mechanical drawing, a drafting teacher, and taught quite a few people over the years, and he taught me that as well as cartooning, which are not related at all, but I liked to draw back then. I loved to play the phonograph in the upstairs bedroom. It was an old phonograph, probably from the early 1950s, that played only 78 speed, 78 revolutions per minute, 78 speed phonograph records, real thick. Many mornings, my Grandma Ruth laughed as she stood at the steamy griddle and tried to create animal shapes out of pancake batter. She was this great, happy, upbeat woman. My grandparents traveled the Midwest with my sister Sue and me sometimes. We traveled to places like Starved Rock, Illinois, New Salem, Illinois, Springfield, Lockport, Dixon, Mounds, and Wisconsin Dells up in Wisconsin. And we learned something new each time we traveled with my grandparents. They didn't force it down our throats, but the history's there if you pay attention. And they made sure we did. Something historic, something special each time we traveled. It is at this time I want to share a story, a one-time story. My grandma's health was always quite delicate, I remember, as I grew up. And after her first heart attack the year I was born, just prior to my birth, doctors instructed her to modify her activities to accommodate her weakened heart.
Take things easy, Ruth.
So she had to give up many of her life's passions. Driving, attending social events, church activities, and she did recuperate, but very slowly. My grandpa had an air conditioner installed in his car as well. Air conditioning was not something that was very common back then in automobiles. So for me, it was always a treat to ride in Grandpa's car in those summer months that were so hot. When I was about 5 years old, my grandpa, Gramma Ruth, and I traveled to Baraboo, Wisconsin to see the Circus World Ringling Brothers Parade, held once a year. During that time, my parents would travel to Cincinnati and do some other things on their own to see old friends, and my sister Sue attended an away camp at that time. So this particular circus parade was a big event back then. Full of color, exotic animals, clowns before clowns were creepy and scary. So it was a clear, sunny, hot summer's day when Grandma Ruth, Grandpa Harold, and 5-year-old me found our viewing place on the steps of the local courthouse. High enough so I could see. Perfect. But the summer's heat and humidity was intense that very day. My grandma told us that she was going to go step down and shelter down by some shade trees. And I remember my grandpa asking her if she was all right, because he took really good care of her after the first heart attack. She said she was. She just wanted to get out of the heat, precautionary only. Within 5 minutes, the parade actually stopped dead quiet, with hundreds and hundreds of people lining the street, and a loudspeaker called my grandpa's name.
Harold Wilkinson, please report to the East Side Courthouse. Emergency.
Grandpa said to me,
Come on, Paulie, let's go. Something's happened to Grandma.
Grandpa moved faster than I'd ever seen him move. I held his hand and I had to run to keep up with him. Releasing my hand, I remember seeing my grandpa run to an ambulance door that had backed up onto the courthouse steps on the other side by the shade trees. I saw 4 men hoisting my grandma's limp, semi-conscious body onto a stretcher. Moving quickly, they then loaded and landed her into the ambulance. A heart attack. I stood on the steps as a nurse came over and reached out her hand kindly and got me. I rode in that ambulance with my Grandma Ruth. My grandpa followed in a car. I remember her gently kind of waking up and taking hold of my hand as she floated in and out of consciousness. I remember sitting in that ambulance and looking out the window once or twice, and I remembered how odd it was when it was you that was in an ambulance with the wailing siren, and it was you that all the people were stopping and pulling over, and they were looking at you in the ambulance. It was a surreal and strange experience, well, the whole thing. Children were not allowed in hospitals back then at all. But my grandpa was with my grandma, and the nurses were there. They would take care of me temporarily. So that day, I recall a hospital nurse sneaking me into an empty, unused waiting room where I had a coloring book and I colored all day, hidden away from the hospital rules and administrators that would put me out the door. Now, I was not a wild kid who was going to tear up a hospital. If you told me to sit and color all day, that's what I did. because she told me to. And I probably did not move at all. I probably just sat in that chair because somebody said, sit in this chair and don't move. After that first day, I spent the next 3 to 4 days, I recall, in a motel, a bare bones motel, it's okay, in Baraboo, Wisconsin. And they had hired a babysitter to sit with me because my grandpa had to be at the hospital with my grandmother. So I was in good hands, but I just was with a stranger I didn't know. Now, there was no available TV channels or pool or anything at this motel. Not that I needed to do that type of thing, but, you know, when you're 5, distraction's a good thing.
I'll be your babysitter.
It was hard for me to be with a stranger.
Y'all sit still.
Too much change. And be at a motel room with nothing to do. But it wasn't as hard. It was not as hard as what my Grandma Ruth was going through. As I said, my parents had traveled to Cincinnati, but quickly made their way back home to be with my Grandma Ruth and pick me up. As much as all the adults told 5-year-old me that everything was going to be all right and everything was okay, I knew differently. I could tell from my grandpa's behavior this was something major. Fear. This was real fear. My grandma did survive this event, heart attack number 2, but that week in Wisconsin almost took a final toll on my Grandma Ruth. However, with time, just like before, she did survive. Quite honestly, well into her 90s, surpassing my grandpa, as I said, and 2 of her own children. You know, it was funny because after it was all over and months had passed, my grandparents and my parents made a big deal. They talked to me often about this, about getting to ride in an ambulance with the siren going.
Pretty neat, huh?
That had to be a treat for you.
An ambulance rider.
Got to go in an ambulance, son.
And how I should share that exciting story with my friends at school the next year in kindergarten. I never told anyone. I was still terrified. And now let's turn back to 1916 and a recollection of my Grandma Ruth as told to my sister Sue at age 16. My grandparents were dating back at that time, probably age 16 and 19, around there, and dating, or courting as it was called at that time, just young Harold and young Ruth.
Months later, sometime in February, Harold has been coming to court me after dinner on Sundays. We have grown quite fond of one another, and my family thinks a great deal of him too. This winter, he and several other young men have been laying the brick road between Sycamore and DeKalb, Illinois, after their morning chores.
I need 10 bricks.
It is a stretch of road about 6 or 7 miles long.
Nice job.
Every day that there isn't snow on the ground, they meet after their noon meal and work on it. May through October, these same young men are hard at work at night and day in their fields and barn. So this is the time of year that suits the creation of the brick road between the 2 towns. Harold tells me about the work and some of the funny things that have happened during the road building. The work sounds backbreaking to me, but Harold has never complained, not once.
Good old Jonesy.
Today is Tuesday, and it has been overcast and gray all day. I long for the sunshine. I have spent the day helping Mother darn the boys' socks and my brother Jack's shirt. Jack got into a rough and tumble with the neighbor boy over a disagreement in a game they were playing. Mother was angry when he came home with the torn shirt, and Father took him behind the chicken coop. When he came back into the house, Jack was quiet but went right out and got more wood for the cook stove, cheerfully. I hear a horse galloping up the road long before I can see her and her rider. It is nearly dusk, and not the time of day when a visitor normally calls. I am familiar with the horse and her rider. It's Harold. What is he doing here? My father goes out to greet him and brings him in the house. Harold has a package for me. A big package. He looks so tired, and I believe he is just coming from working on the road. We sit in our parlor with my family, and I open the package. There it is, the most absolutely perfectly beautiful blue hyacinth plant in full bloom. Harold explains that after working on the road, he went into town, DeKalb, to get supplies for tomorrow and passed a florist shop. He said the hyacinth in the window reminded him of the blue of my eyes. This made me blush a bit. He clearly wrapped it carefully, placed it gently in his saddlebag, and came to me directly. He knows how much I love flowers and how I am so ready for spring to be here. My heart is his. We marry in May of that same year. Years go by, and one day Harold tells me he would never have had the courage to approach me that warm spring night at the harvest ball if I had not winked at him from across the room. I never divulged that it was a petrified blink, not a wink. In his mind, it was a wink that brought us together for more than 50 years. And I'm happy with that.
Moving ahead in time, when I was age 16 through 21, I'm a teenager, my grandmother's now, close to 70. I mowed my grandma's grass at her house downriver and did yard work most weekends at her home, just, nearby. She was on her own now as my grandfather had passed away. She missed him so much and talked about him a lot. Gramma Ruth knew how much my grandpa and I liked Pepsi from our childhood. It had been a connection to my grandfather. Because of that connection, and I kept coming down every weekend, she continued to buy Pepsi and make sure I got a bottle after yard work. I loved that. Icy cold. This particular weekly time spent with my grandma was my favorite, because she always, after the yard work was done, she'd say, come on inside, sit down, cool off, you must be so hot, let's have a Pepsi, etc. Sure. And she shared stories, and these were good stories. My grandma was a storyteller of a very high magnitude. Not made up stories, but just retellings of the past. Detailed recollections of the people and the places. She was so good. The characters seemed to come to life again. Tremendous detail and recollection. So my Grandma Ruth and I would sit in her front room, as I said, and she would share things with me. Stories of her life. Stories of my grandpa and the private World War I experiences he had had, ones he wouldn't tell anyone else, and now she shared them with me. And how pure courage, grit, and pain and determination got him out of Europe from France and back to the United States in 1918. Her stories were fact-based. My descriptors that I just gave you right now, courage, grit, etc., were added by me after hearing how my grandpa survived after losing his lower leg in a landmine explosion in World War I, France. There were stories of my mom and my uncles as they grew up in the farm and in the city. There were many stories, such as when my grandma quipped to me,
Movie star Rudolph Valentino. Oh, he was my heartthrob. Oh.
There was one prominent story that has stuck with me all these years. I've got a lot of them, but for her, as my Grandma Ruth explained to me, it was 1916. My grandpa and grandma were courting. This was a Sunday. It was God's Day. It was after church, and they decided to stop and rest near an apple orchard abundant with these fresh, large, juicy apples. It was apple season, and these trees were ready to be harvested. The stillness of the countryside was actually not quiet at all, but as a symphony of chirping birds, distant frogs, barking dogs, and locusts buzzing in the hot, late summer sun. Now, Harold was the oldest. My grandpa was the oldest of, I think, 11 children, if I'm not mistaken, and without doubt, the most responsible. Harold and Ruth, my future grandpa and grandma, innocently took a seat to rest at the base of the largest apple tree near the creek. But not before Harold chose just the right apple off that tree. He looked all over the tree and he found what he considered to be a very special apple. Then he took that apple and he shined it. You know, you shine an apple on your clothes. Shined it, using his off-white cotton shirt, which he had pressed and laundered earlier that day. That apple was buffed until it became a shiny, glassy-looking, juicy sphere.
First bite?
He offered to my Grandma Ruth.
No, thank you. Go ahead.
Ruth answered. As he sat down, Harold was deliberate as he bit solidly into that apple. Harold sat there and looked at his bite mark for a second or two into the apple, and then he held the apple out in front of my grandma's face. And he said,
See that? Look at that bite. It's a perfect bite. That matters down the road, you know.
My Grandma Ruth at age 16 knew exactly what he meant. It was a simpler time. Advertising and marketing were practically non-existent. My grandpa was marketing himself. He came from a strong and sturdy Christian family, one with good teeth as well. And you know what? That meant a lot. That in the future, if they got married, there would be a strong possibility that their children might have some good teeth. That was a big selling point back in 1916. Oh yeah. Finally, I know I mentioned earlier that after my grandma's first heart attack the year I was born, doctors had her modify her activities to accommodate her weakened heart. So she had to give up many things, and one of these things was driving. There's a lot of stress in driving. So here's the setup. I recall a time when my Grandpa Harold, my Grandma Ruth, and I, once again, were on our way to Wisconsin Dells for a vacation. I was probably about 7 years old. Summer. It's a hot and humid summer day. It bore down on us. It was intense. But in the car, the air conditioner kept temps and the passengers cool, calm, and collected. Very nice. As we drove north on Bunker Road towards Wisconsin Dells, sparse traffic on the narrow two-lane road slowed, slower and slower, and then all traffic stopped. It looked like there was possibly an accident up ahead on the road. It wasn't long before my grandpa turned off the car and put down the windows and got out to see if he could help up ahead.
You two stay put. I'll be right back.
Grandpa had quite a bit of medical training and was always willing to lend a hand. I watched my grandpa slowly walk ahead toward the accident until he was out of sight. As I said, it was a hot day, and it wasn't too long before the humid, dank breeze slowly permeated the car. Hot, sticky. You know, as a child, you learn to adapt, but the sun was beating down on my grandma on the passenger side. 5, 10, 15 minutes may have passed, and my Grandma Ruth abruptly turned to me and said quite confidently,
I'm going to start the car, and I'm going to move it up under the trees. There'll be shade and cool temperatures there, Polly.
But I immediately panicked. Why? Well, I was told by my mom, by my dad, by my grandpa, that my grandma should never drive a car again in any condition. But what they never did tell me was,
Grandma shouldn't drive.
why? So I just assumed that my grandma might be, you're a kid, she might be some kind of psychotic driver or was out of control or couldn't drive a car because it would be out of control crazy, and she was a bad driver. I didn't know, and I just knew she would start the car and floor it and shoot us into a ditch or roll the car over. You know, what did I know except from what I saw in cartoons back then? I was 7.
No, Grandma, no. Don't drive. You can't drive.
I tried to get out of the back doors of the car, but they were locked. I was doomed, I thought. Already sweating and panting, I began to panic, and my grandma slid into the driver's seat, and she powered up the engine. But to my surprise, We slowly, safely idled over to the shade of a tree just off the road. I didn't get it. I thought Grandma couldn't drive, or shouldn't drive. I held that story in my head until I was about 16. I don't know why I never told anyone. But by then I knew that it was her heart that kept her away from the driver's seat. And on one of those yard work days when I was in my teen years that I loved so much with her, I sat with my Gramma Ruth, drinking a Pepsi, and retold her my version of that same story. I expressed my 7-year-old panic and fear from back then. She did not recall that story at first, but when I told her that 7-year-old me just assumed that she might be some kind of psychotic driver, or was out of control crazy when she drove, or she was driven by some insane revenge or something behind the wheel, I had no idea, and that I panicked that she would start the car and floor it and shoot us into a ditch or roll us over. Bodies everywhere. Gramma Ruth began to laugh and laugh and laugh until it was one of those silent laughs where she's just chuckling like this. You can see her smiling, and she laughed herself sideways in her chair. There she sat quietly, making noise. That was her. A tremendous sense of humor, love, confidence in herself and others. We spoke of that story often after I retold it that day. For years after, she often retold the story to everyone, laughing with the same intensity each time. So what is our takeaway for today? What did we learn? What did I learn? At age 56, my grandma had a major heart attack the year I was born. The doctor came and gave her an injection directly into her heart. She did not only come back to life, but she seemed to embrace every new challenge and experience from her birth year in 1900 until her passing in 1996. Stories became more vivid to her. She embraced life a bit more, a bit harder, and she embraced those people that were similar to her. I can't summarize my Gramma Ruth's life. But as for this episode about her, I'd simply say, love hard. And when life's car gets a bit too hot, don't be afraid to pull it on over to that cool shade tree, because who knows, that tree might even be an apple tree, where you might be able to take a perfect bite in a shiny apple. Here's to 2 fantastic grandparents, Grandpa Harold, Grandma Ruth, and 1 extremely grateful grandson. Thank you. For Life's Learning Curve, I'm Paul Hart.
Subscribe to Life's Learning Curve at lifeslearningcurve.org and leave a review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, or Podchaser. Episode 49, The Perfect Bite of Life's Learning Curve podcast, was put together by producer Sebastian T. Dog, executive producer Paul Hart, technical director Gene Jensen, editor Paul Richards, audio and sound, as always, Riley Hart. Our production manager, Scott Hurley. Studio equipment manager, Dawn Compton. Additional audio narration provided by Sue Hart. Recorded by John Strahl. Find us on Facebook and listen to us just about everywhere podcasts are heard. Visit our website, lifeslearningcurve.org, and subscribe. Read one of our blogs or shoot us an email. This episode has imaginative voice recreations to protect the privacy of others. Some names have been changed and characters conflated. The Perfect Bite, episode 49. I'm Paul Hart, and we will be back soon with more stories from Life's Learning Curve.
We're clear.